Before we pray, let's read Psalm 91, NIV. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. Now, let us pray together. You never saw it coming. One moment, your life was calm, perhaps not perfect, but predictable. The next, everything seemed to fall apart. That single phone call, the unexpected diagnosis, the job loss, the betrayal, the silence from someone who once made your heart feel safe, whatever it was. It arrived like a thief in the night, stealing your sense of security. Suddenly, fear began to speak louder than faith, and peace became a distant memory. You didn't know that fear had a sound until it started echoing inside your chest. A restless thump, thump, thump. The what-ifs multiplied in your mind, each one darker than the last. You tried to sleep, but every hour was thick with dread. You tried to pray, but your words felt hollow, like stones skipping across the surface of an ocean you could no longer touch. That was the night you sat on the edge of your bed, eyes unfocused, heart racing, asking, "Where are you, God?" Not in anger, though. Part of you did feel angry, but in longing, desperate longing. You weren't asking for answers anymore. You were asking for presence, for nearness, for safety. The truth is, you were afraid of being alone in the storm. Not just alone without people, but alone without Him. You had heard sermons that told you, God is our refuge and strength. But until that moment, they were just words. Beautiful, distant words. But that night, you needed them to be real. And slowly, like a whisper rising within you, they began to be. Not in thunder or lightning, not in a sudden reversal of circumstances, but in a warmth that didn't come from your blanket, in a calm that didn't make sense, and in a name that began to feel like shelter, Jesus. You remembered Psalm 91 not as a memory verse, but as a lifeline. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. You clung to that like someone clings to a rope in rising floodwaters. Because deep down, even in your fear, something inside you believed He hadn't left. Maybe you didn't feel Him, but faith was whispering a quiet truth. He is your refuge. He is your fortress. You began to breathe slower, not because the fear was gone, but because you were beginning to believe you weren't facing it alone, that He was still there watching, waiting, arms open. Maybe you didn't run to Him right away. Maybe you sat in silence first. Maybe you questioned. But He was patient. And when you finally whispered His name again, not out of habit, but out of hunger, He responded. Not with a booming voice, but with a holy nearness that began to settle the storm inside you. That night didn't end with fireworks. It ended with a fragile trust forming again, like a candle lit in the dark. Small, but real. You didn't know what tomorrow held, but you were beginning to understand who held you. You saw now that refuge doesn't mean escape. It means presence. Fortress doesn't mean you won't be attacked. It means you're defended. And in those early hours of a new and uncertain day, you began to say it aloud, not as a cliche, but as a declaration. My God, in whom I trust. The next few days felt like walking through a battlefield, not of bombs and bullets, but of thoughts and emotions. You still woke up with that heaviness in your chest, still heard the inner voice asking, what if it gets worse? But something had shifted. There was now a second voice, a quieter one, reminding you, you are not alone. You began to speak the word over yourself, even if your voice trembled. He will cover me with His feathers. Under His wings, I will find refuge. At first, it felt like trying to hold water with bare hands. But slowly, the truth began to sink in, not just into your mind, but into your spirit. You started to notice that the fear, while still present, didn't have the same grip on you. It was like standing in the middle of a storm, but feeling a strange stillness wrap around you. Not because the storm had vanished, but because you had found shelter. And that shelter was not an idea or a verse or a feeling. It was Him, the living God. The one who doesn't just promise protection from afar, but invites you to dwell in His presence. You began to understand the difference between visiting God and living in Him. Before, you prayed occasionally, perhaps before meals or in crisis. But now, you found yourself whispering prayers in the hallway, singing worship in the kitchen, reaching for Him like breath itself. You were no longer just attending to God like a guest. You were making Him your home. That's when you felt it most clearly, the shadow of His wings. You didn't see them with your eyes, but you sensed their covering, like a holy canopy stretched over your weary heart. You found comfort not in explanations, but in proximity. The closer you moved toward Him, the more peace followed. He reminded you of Elijah, who hid in a cave, expecting God to show up in wind, fire, or earthquake, but found Him instead in a whisper. That was you. The whisper became your anchor. You weren't foolish. You still faced your problems head on. You made the calls, took the steps, braced for outcomes. But all the while, you carried the unseen covering of a God who does not sleep, who places His angels around you, who fights battles you never even see. At times, you were tempted to doubt again. That's normal. It's part of the walk. But even in your doubt, you were learning to return, to hide not in distractions or denial, but in Him. And when you did, you began to taste the mystery of true safety, not from harm, but in Him. And one night, as the wind rustled outside your window and your worries tried to rise again, you whispered aloud, "Lord, I take shelter in You." And it wasn't empty. It wasn't wishful. It was trust. You began to declare it, again and again, even with tears in your eyes. "I will not fear the terror of night. I will not dread the arrows by day, because I dwell under His shadow." Because this was more than survival now. It was communion. You weren't just asking Him to fix things. You were staying close to the one who held all things. And somewhere in that sacred closeness, something unshakable began to grow in you. A stillness, a knowing, a resting place. You had found your refuge, not a place, a person, your God. There came a morning simple and quiet when you woke up and realized something had changed. The problem hadn't vanished. The world was still full of uncertainty. But you were different. You didn't wake up dreading the day. You woke up speaking His name, not as a ritual, but as instinct. "Good morning, Lord." Your first breath was a prayer, not out of fear this time, but gratitude. You were still walking through the valley, yes, but you were walking with Him, and that changed everything. Because when you've made God your refuge, life doesn't need to be safe to be sacred. You can sit in the doctor's office, the courtroom, the classroom, or the quiet kitchen table and still feel covered, shielded, strong. Not because you're strong on your own, but because you're hidden in Him. "He is my refuge and my fortress," you now say, not just as comfort but as identity. You've walked through the dark and found out who you really are, not a victim of fear, but a child of God. Not unprotected, but fiercely loved. You used to think a fortress was about walls. Now you know it's about nearness. His nearness. Even when everything feels like it's falling apart, you're not crumbling. Because you're not building on the sand anymore. You're building on the rock. And so you've started to stand differently. Not prideful, not self-assured, but rooted. Like a tree beside living waters. When the winds come, you may sway, but you do not fall. When the drought comes, You do not wither. Why? Because you are planted in the presence of the Almighty. Now, when someone else is afraid, you find yourself saying the words you once barely believed. God is our refuge. He's got you. You say it with tears, because you remember what it was like not to know. And you say it with fire, because now you do. You've become a voice of refuge to others, because you've lived under the shadow of His wings. You've weathered the storm, and now you carry the peace of the shelter with you wherever you go. When fear rises, you declare, I will not be shaken. When lies whisper, you reply, He is my shield and rampart. When you feel alone, you remember, He commands His angels concerning me. And your heart, once anxious and guarded, is now open to love again, open to believe, open to surrender, not in defeat, but in freedom. You've learned the secret of the psalmist, not just to read about God's protection, but to live in it, not to visit when things go wrong, but to abide always, in Him, with Him, for Him. Now you move through life with a quiet strength, not untouched by pain, but anchored in promise. You know storms will come, but you also know where to run. And when the enemy tries to draw near again, you lift your eyes, lift your voice and say, My God is my refuge and my fortress. In Him I trust. He is my safe place. I am not afraid. I dwell in the secret place. I rest in the shadow of the Almighty. That is your song now. Not of fear, but of faith. Not of retreat, but of rootedness. Not of panic, but of peace. For the Lord is your refuge. The Lord is your fortress. And under His wings you are home. You don't know exactly when the fear lost its grip. There was no dramatic finish, no shining light through your window, no audible voice from heaven, just a gentle unfolding like morning breaking after a long night. You simply found yourself breathing again, not perfectly, not painlessly, but peacefully. You found that you could rest, not because the world had settled, but because your soul had. That's what it means to dwell, to choose, day after day, moment after moment, to remain in His présence en eau, as a visitor, not as a guest, but as one who belongs. You don't run to God only when things fall apart. You stay with Him even when things seem fine, because you've learned that the safest place isn't the absence of trouble, it's the nearness of the Lord. And now, even when the waves rise again, you are not tossed, you are anchored, because your faith is no longer built on feelings, but on truth, on the unshakable promise of Psalm 91, on the faithfulness of the God who has never failed you. This is your new rhythm, resting in His shadow, walking in His light, standing in His strength, no longer ruled by panic, no longer led by fear, because the Most High is not just your refuge. He is your home, and under His wings you are forever safe.